As the human rights movement faces new global challenges, it has to find ways to reinvent itself in order to remain relevant and strong. That means adapting its ways of working and building synergies across regions and internationally.
For me, South are those people who are at the receiving end of unjust and unequal power everywhere. South are people who are LGBTs, who are women, who are minorities, who are people of color, people of different ethnicities, everywhere. And that's the discourse we need to change.
Up to now, we've tended to silo organizations, thinking that a national group can only influence a national agenda, and international groups based in the North are there to influence the global agenda. I think the current geopolitical context that we're living in requires us to see how these all interact with each other. And more than ever, national organizations do have a role to play, and regional organizations have a role to play in the global space.
As we all know, universities and research centers and even NGOs in the global north, in the US and Europe, tend to be dominant in terms of the influence, in terms of how many quotes they get, for example, in newspapers, in journals, in books. And that's to the detriment of the efficacy of human rights ideas, because they tend to be seen, those ideas, as less legitimate and less rooted in local realities.
I think what's really at the hallmark of successful collaboration and network building with national organizations is co-creating strategy. And I think if we've learned one thing over the last 5 years in the global human rights movement, it's that local, regional, international organizations need to work together to co-create a strategy at the outset.
So our focus isn't exclusively or even primarily on human rights abuses or environmental abuses that are taking place at the hands of people operating in the South, but rather looking at the ways in which the banks, the financial institutions, the politicians, the multinational corporations are playing a key role in driving the kind of natural resource exploitation and related abuses we're concerned about.
What we are seeing is a rebalancing of the human rights movement, around the world. I think it's the case now that the networks and alliances that have been developed in Asia and Latin America, and increasingly now in Africa, those voices are starting to really be heard as a key component of the global dialogue and the global debate that's happening, certainly around business and human rights.
The idea that we now use several times a year of having this video conference with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs all around the country came from something we heard from South Africa. So we adapted that to our situation, and now it's a public mechanism that happens regularly. So I think there's exchange of ideas that had impacted the way we work a lot.
When you have a Colombian organization working with an Egyptian organization around the question of closing space, the conversation is very different than the conversation that you may have when you have that Egyptian organization talking to a global organization. That doesn't mean that you don't need both, but I think that when you have this kind of South-South conversation around similar challenges, and when you have a different kind of advocacy around this closing space issue coming from this different perspective, you are gaining something.
Through that sharing, there is firstly a lot of mutual learning. There is a lot of resonance around the concerns and so on of our respective organizations and also of the clients that we serve. And there is a possibility for us to build a better understanding of how the way in which we use rights and the way in which we use international frameworks can actually be of benefit in the domestic context.
I think the collaboration South-South has always been important to the network. However, increasingly we've seen it as important to actually make those South-North, North-South connections, particularly in the sense of the Secretariat having an office in New York in the United States, but also recognizing that human rights violations are happening in those contexts and trying to link up struggles in those different regions. For instance, in Detroit, where 30,000 families have been shut off of water and sanitation, the network put together an amicus intervention, and some of the grantees here, including De Justicia, other organizations like SERI in South Africa, actually collectively brought together comparative jurisprudence and collectively put in a third-party intervention in Detroit. So actually standing with social movements in Detroit.
If you think about the big challenge faced by the human rights movement now, whether it's climate change, whether it's poverty and economic inequality, whether it's the challenges faced by created by technology, artificial intelligence, to effectively engage with those issues, we're going to have to create new alliances with environmental actors, with development actors, with technological actors as well. So there's a lot of flux, I would say.
The resilience capacity, the fighting back willingness among the human rights movement is striking, is amazing. And maybe this is the key challenge for now and tomorrow, how to release this amazing energy from the people. Actually, it's not a club, the human rights movement, that would, detain all the knowledge to actually fight back. No, this is deeply rooted in the hands of the people who do stand up for rights.